Alright, and just fly right through that gap in the trees. Okay. Lots of fun.
Oh my goodness.
Alright, and now pull the power to idle, push the nose over. Idle, nose over.
Oh my goodness.
Alright.
That's a freaking rush right there, man. Oh my goodness.
Approach, you're not going to believe this. I just bought a free pilot training.
Alright, so I'm here with Seth Lake, DPE and instructor extraordinaire, and today I'm getting my tailwheel endorsement. So I guess we'll start this thing out by just give me a little bit of information that I should know before we get going.
Well, kind of you've seen this in practice already in the past day, flying tailwheel. But the main thing is to remember with tailwheel. Well, there's a lot of things to remember with tailwheel, but the primary difference is that your pivoting point is further aft, much further aft than you're used to.
Yeah.
So your rudder authority or your tailwheel authority, depending on if you're in flight or on the ground, is a lot more sensitive. And we kind of experienced that a couple times.
Yeah.
Especially in this particular tailwheel, it has drum brakes, which aren't as effective as the disc brakes that you're used to.
Yeah.
And that rudder movement that you're having to make is, they call it like a rudder dance or punchy or jabby. Those are all kind of adjectives we'd use to describe the rudder movement, and it's just more rudder movement at a higher frequency rather than kind of the slow, small pressures that you're used to in the 172.
When I read about it, you read about dancing on the rudders, and I didn't really think anything of it, but even after reading it, I still was like putting in that rudder and just like kind of leaving it, and that is definitely not what you want to do. I figured out the hard way, but overall, I cannot believe how much fun this was.
There we go. A nice wide runway here. We're just going to hold it off and do a nice three-pointer. We're going uphill, and we got pretty long grass, so we're not going to have to use the brakes at all.
Russell traffic, turning left downwind, runway 7, Russell traffic.
There we go. Tail. Yep, pin that tail. Going uphill, no problem.
I was blown away.
Yeah.
I was not expecting that. I was expecting it to be fun, but not that fun.
It's a lot of fun. It opens up, with the Taylorcraft specifically, it's a very light airplane.
Yeah.
Really short landing distance, short takeoff distance relatively.
Yeah.
Really you need about 500 to 600 feet of clearway.
Yeah, clearway.
And ideally you'd have about 1,000 feet of, no obstacles, and you can get in and out of the place pretty easily. And that opens up kind of a whole new world of places you can go.
Yeah.
So we went up to, yesterday we went to, there was just one charted field that we went to that was actually on the charts, and that was Spring Mountain.
Spring Mountain was the only charted one.
Yeah. Landers Loop, it may be on the chart now, but still, there's not like there's an airfield diagram for any of these places.
Yeah.
They're all private use, so we all, we call ahead and make sure we have permission to use that. But yeah, we went to Nathan's, he's my friend Nathan, he's kind of the farm strip. We went to the kind of mountaintop strip.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, and then we went to kind of a more backwoodsy strip with the with Landers Loop, where you had kind of that terrain feature there, cut into the tree. So
I liked Spring Mountain, and I also like Landers. I like the other one too, but that Spring Mountain was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
I just cannot believe how much fun that one is.
So I think that's part of the fun, is it opens up the places you can go, and you're not just going to a big boring, asphalt strip somewhere.
Yeah.
You're going to these places that you look down from the air and you wouldn't even recognize them really as a runway.
Oh, I know. So I wrote down a few questions. So before this excursion yesterday, I wrote down a bunch of questions I had. I read the Airplane Flying Handbook, and I was like, I'm gonna come into this prepared. So those rude people flying over. I tried to come into this prepared, and so I had a bunch of these questions, and some of them were answered. I think actually 99% of them were answered, but like I wanted to go ahead and ask them, because if somebody's wanting to get their tailwheel endorsement, I think these are good things are thinking about. And I think here in the near future we'll get Mike's tailwheel endorsement, and if he has questions, I definitely want to hear them too, because if he has them and I have them, then you guys probably have them too. So one of the things in the Airplane Flying Handbook is it says, like, primarily, you want your heels on the floor and you don't want to use brakes on taxi. Why is that?
If you accidentally grab a brake, the tail can easily swing around on you.
Yeah.
And you're going to lose that directional control. And you can do at a higher speed, that's called a ground loop. You can do that on a slower speed as well. That happened to us a couple times where we're at a very slow speed and there's about a 30-degree range where you have tailwheel control.
Yeah, 30 degrees.
And it's sort of tailwheel steering, but it's more of tailwheel suggestion in the tailcraft, because you have cables that are connected from your rudder pedals directly to the tailwheel. But it's connected to the tailwheel via a spring. So when you push, you're not actually moving the tailwheel directly, you're pulling a spring, and that spring is what's pulling the tailwheel.
That makes sense.
And so it acts as a little bit of a shock absorber, but then you also lose a little bit of control. And then if that tailwheel pivots past the 30-degree mark, it goes into its free castering zone. And you've probably seen on videos where a tailwheel aircraft can basically turn, around a point almost. And that's when it's free castering. Sometimes you want it to do that, but often when you're taxiing, you don't want to do that.
For Kevin did it when we came into parking, whip that tail around and just, you can kind of free spin and like really park into tight spots if you're skilled like he is. But.
Yeah, and that's useful sometimes when you're in the plane, but it's also useful when you're positioning the plane after you've parked.
Mm-hmm.
You can just get down and push the tail around and park it.
Yeah.
In between some trees or something.
So with that spring on there, does it cause any kind of delay?
Yeah, there is a little bit of a delay. There's two springs, one on each side.
Yeah.
So when the cable is pulling that spring, and the spring is actually what's pulling the tailwheel. And so that I think that also acts as a shimmy dampener as well. It keeps it from the shimmy happening when you're landing. But yeah, it's not a direct connection, and that's on. I don't know if that's on all tail wheels, but most of the tail wheels have the spring linkage right there.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, so another thing on taxi, a lot of this stuff kind of gets answered in the plane, but it said, you need opposite rudder to straighten the nose a lot of times. And so like we'd get into that turn and it seemed like we needed that opposite rudder to like straighten it up. Almost like to center the tail in a way.
Yeah. Well, you're moving two things with the rudder pedal. You're moving that cable, so you're suggesting the tail will go a certain position, but you're also moving the actual rudder. So that rudder is using aerodynamic force to turn the tail as well. And that's why we get into that counterintuitive where you need to add power to basically blast air over that rudder, which gives you aerodynamic force to move the tail in the direction that you want it to eventually move the nose.
Okay.
So that's why, let's say you're in a pretty sharp left-hand turn, you might need to start adding a lot of right rudder early.
Yeah.
To roll out of that left-hand turn in time. You can't do it just in time because the differential braking's not as effective. A good way to practice or kind of get an idea of why tailwheel is a little more sensitive, longitudinally speaking, is like you've been to Walmart, right?
Yeah.
You push your shopping cart.
Yeah.
Where do the wheels caster on a shopping cart normally?
Front.
On the front. Okay. Now take that same shopping cart and try pushing it backwards.
Squirrely.
Yeah, it gets a little squirrely, and that's what a tailwheel is. So it's like pushing a shopping cart from the other end. The castering is behind you. And really the shopping cart's not apples to apples because you're pushing right back there, but you can see how that would be a little more squirrely. That's a scientific term.
I like it. One thing the Flying Handbook talked about is how the airplanes typically create more lift because they're set at a higher angle of attack. what should I do with the stick? I know, obviously in the plane you showed me, but so one of the things I read is that normally you'll have full back on the stick in a headwind, and then it said full forward in a tailwind, but is that true, or is it, depending on how much wind?
Yeah, I mean, again, really light aircraft. So you'll hear experienced tailwheel pilots say you need to fly the airplane all the way to the chocks. And that's true, because when it's windy, the plane, it's like a kite,
Yeah.
If you've played with a kite before in really windy conditions, you can't just, even when you're not flying the kite, you're just carrying it somewhere. You kind of need to be careful on how you hold that, because if the wind gets underneath it,
That's true.
it can try to pull it out of your hand, An umbrella on a really windy day is kind of the same thing. You have to kind of tilt the umbrella to make sure the wind doesn't get beneath the umbrella. It'll try to yank it away from you, or you'll see it collapse the umbrella on the old movies and stuff. That was kind of a funny thing. So you have to be mindful, think of your flight controls as an umbrella. You want to keep the air from getting underneath them, and kind of pulling that out of your hand. So when you have a headwind, you're generally, now the air is trying to lift the plane up. So you want to pay particular attention to the tail wheel. You want to keep the tail wheel on the ground. So you're going to have to apply full back pressure on a headwind, and that elevator is going to, that flipper on the back is going to come up. The air is going to hit it and force the tail down and keep the tail. I call it, pinning the tail to the ground. You're going to pin that tail to the ground because you want as much tail wheel authority at low speeds as possible.
There we go. Tail. Yep, pin that tail. Going uphill, no problem. On the stopping. Very good.
It was saying that it's not uncommon to be taxiing and to become airborne. Have you seen this?
Yeah, unintentionally, yes. If you're not paying attention, the tail can come up flying. And there's been more than a few accidents of, a gust of wind gets under the tail. If you panic and hit the brakes at that point, you can actually nose the plane over.
Prop strike.
Yeah, and it'll nose over, and now you're looking at the ground and your tail's way in the air. That can definitely happen. Yeah.
Here's another. This was probably the biggest question I had, like without reading the book, and then once I read the book, it really didn't answer this question. It talks about on final your weather vaning, and we got to see that a little bit in the plane. How much more would you say we weather vane? And the other question is, I typically use the wing low method on final. Could you crab into the wind down final? Is that a smart way to fly the plane and put that rudder in at the last minute? Or do you think it's better just to do the wing low?
Yeah, so this is where, tailwheel and nosewheel aircraft are basically the same. You're using the same crosswind controls.
Okay.
And you can use the same techniques, and I teach the same thing in the C-130, in fact. There's kind of two schools of thought, I think. You can either fly down final with the crosswind controls in. The upside to this is you have a longer time to set those crosswind controls and align the longitudinal axis of the plane with the center line of your runway. That's the goal with crosswind controls, is we don't want, and especially in a tailwheel aircraft, it's very sensitive to those lateral movements.
Yeah.
So, and side loading especially. So if we side load it, the two mains will touch down, and they'll try to correct by lining themselves. So if you land a little sideways, they'll side load and try to align themselves naturally. Now that gets your tail back here swinging in the opposite direction, and so you've got this oscillation developed, and you'll try to overcorrect, and then it'll come back around, and that's when you ground lead.
Yeah, that's
on landing. So we want to remove any side load from our main wheels, and the way to do that is with the wing low method, where you'll actually have one wheel touch down before the other one, but they're lined up with the longitudinal axis, or the center line of the runway. So you can fly with those crosswind controls all the way down final, or you can set them. You can fly in a crab and set the crosswind controls just before landing at some point. Usually around 50 feet would be the kind of the latest that I'd want to see that set. And that would be for maybe a more experienced pilot with how much, control forces you'd need to set that. That method is a little bit, for me, that's a little more stable, and I'm really experienced in the plane, so that's how I prefer to fly it. Both in the C-130 and the tailwheel and the Traveler, all the planes I fly, that's kind of what I do. Is I crab for the majority of final. I set my wing low crosswind controls right around 100 to 50 feet, and then I land with zero side load. If you set this way back on final, so let's say you're on a 3-mile final and you start setting your crosswind controls, the downside of doing that, although it gives you longer time to hold the controls, the downside is the wind is typically higher. When you're on a 3-mile final, you're up at 1,000 feet or close to. The wind's typically a little bit higher, so as you descend, the winds generally die down a little bit, especially when you get around any tree lines. And so those control forces are going to have to be reduced all the way down final.
I definitely noticed that on the first field we went to. That, in fact, I almost feel like maybe we had winds at different directions on that first one.
Yeah.
Up at high altitudes, and we came down, it was different on the ground.
Yeah, the wind was, we had a little bit of a tailwind, which is, that's a whole other thing with not really just tailwheel flying, but backcountry flying. A lot of these fields, you're forced to make an approach in a certain direction because of obstacles. So there may be fields that you just can't use in certain weather conditions because you don't have the option to come at them from a different angle. You have to, there's only one way in and there's only one way out.
Well,
and that first runway we went to is really, you can only land going to the west.
Yeah, it's true.
And you can only take off going to the east. And so landing to the west, we had a little bit of a tailwind.
And I floated those first couple, I think. Or I floated at least one of them, I know that. Because so we go around, I think we got plenty of runway.
Yeah.
But, okay, let's see. Oh, so this was a question I had, but I know the answer now. But so on takeoff, we raise the tail. How much left turning tendency is there? We talk about gyroscopic precession, and it's not really an issue in a nose wheel airplane because you pitch up, and you get the right turn instead of the left turn, and that's offset by the other left turning tendencies. But in a tail wheel, you pull the tail up, and then there's gyroscopic precession. How much rudder dance do you feel because of that gyroscopic precession?
Well, in the Taylorcraft, you probably noticed it was hard to see any particular one because you're having to fly the rudder all the time.
Yeah.
So it's not like you're just always having a bunch of right rudder in there. You're constantly dancing on the rudder to keep it tracking straight down the field because it's such a light airplane.
Yeah.
Also, it's relatively low powered as well, so all of those left turning tendencies, P factor, gyroscopic precession, torque, are going to be less apparent in a 65 horsepower engine. When we go to something like a T6, something with a lot of power up front, then that's when you're going to see significant rudder forces needed to overcome the P factor and gyroscopic precession.
In that case, where you nose over in like a T6, is that going to be? How much more significant would that be?
Yeah, it's just related to engine power. So yeah, you're going to feel more rudder pressure there, where you might have to do that rudder dance where initially, with the tail on the ground, you've got a lot of P factor.
Yeah.
And so you're going to need significant right rudder. Now, as you pick the tail up, it's not that you're going to need left rudder, it's just you might need less right rudder because P factor is decreasing.
Okay.
Gyroscopic precession is a little bit worse then because you're changing that movement, right? So you can play with a little gyro and you can try to move the gyro.
Yeah.
And I think the basic principle is, there's a force that's perpendicular to the direction you're moving it.
Moves ahead of the force 90 degrees.
And so you have a little bit of that spiral or the gyroscopic precession.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So you have the precession, but then you also have reduced P factor. So typically on like your higher powered tailwheel aircraft, you're still you're just going to need different variations of right rudder on takeoff.
So, but because the other stuff changes too, it's really, you really don't even notice it. And like I said, I read all this theoretical stuff
Yeah.
and it didn't even seem to matter.
Yeah,
until you got in the plane.
not that it doesn't matter. I mean, physics is still working in the plane. You know, it's still a fact. But because, you know, on paper we're not dealing with a dynamic environment.
Yeah.
You know, we're kind of looking at things in a vacuum. But in the real world, you know, everything's incredibly dynamic, and the fact that you need right rudder because of physics might be totally negated because of the wind you're experiencing that day. And you wind up needing a lot of left and right rudder just to keep the nose of the aircraft going down the runway.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. I asked this in the plane and you answered the question, but I'll go ahead and ask it again. 3-point takeoffs. Why would you do that? I know this plane doesn't like 3-point takeoffs, but I know some of the newer ones you can do it on.
Yeah, it's not that this plane doesn't like 3-point. The big advantage of 3-point is you're pinning that tail to the ground. You're having your maximum angle of attack, right? 'Cause
Yeah.
You've got the bottom wing exposed to the most airflow, so you're going to kind of pop off the ground a little bit earlier. You're also keeping the prop farther away from the ground, which could be an advantage if you're on a really rough field. I might want to do a 3-point.
Okay.
Because it's keeping that prop further away from any debris that could be on the ground. So those are the advantages. The disadvantages are I'm going to have decreased forward visibility of the entire takeoff roll.
Yeah, I can see that.
And that's basically the primary downside. The main thing that I like about a 3-point takeoff is that you're keeping that tailwheel authority for the majority of your takeoff roll. So I would do that in any crosswind condition. I would want to pin the tail.
Okay.
Because my tailwheel authority is kind of on a scale. My tailwheel authority is really good at low speeds. And then it changes to my rudder authority at higher speeds is really good.
Yeah.
So at high speeds, I want my rudder, I want my tail flying because I have rudder authority.
Yeah.
At low speeds, I want my tail wheel down because I have tail wheel authority.
I think that's the biggest thing I noticed. Once I got the tail airborne, it was completely natural. Like there was nothing unnatural about what was happening after we got the tail airborne. It was just a matter of like that strangeness because I just hadn't experienced that before.
Yeah. So that was because we had relatively calm winds. You know, if we had a strong crosswind,
More.
as soon as you get the tail airborne, now the plane's wanting to weather vane.
Yeah.
And unlike a nose wheel aircraft, you only have 2 points of contact. So it would take significant rudder pressures
To keep it from doing that.
to keep it from weather vaning. And you could easily get the tail flying before you have enough authority to overcome a crosswind. Which
Okay.
means it would be impossible to keep it tracking straight in certain crosswind environments
And I think,
at low speeds.
I've seen videos of tailwheel crashes, and these people are like super experienced pilots, and I think they get themselves into these situations where it doesn't matter how skilled you are, if this happens to you and your tailwind's beyond limits. Like in a Cessna, tailwind or a crosswind beyond limits, I can still do it, and really there's not usually a problem. But in this plane, I feel like you don't want to exceed any crosswind limitations.
Yeah, the crosswind in this, if you get the tail flying at the wrong time, it will spin you around. Like there's nothing you can do to overcome it. If you're not moving fast enough to put airflow over the rudder, the crosswind it'll overpower it rather quickly, and you're just gonna sit there and spin. Again, push a shopping cart from the opposite end and see how easy it is to just spin a donut, versus pushing it normally. It's like impossible for you to do a little donut,
I asked this in the plane and we discussed it. Wheel landings versus 3-point landings. Why would you do one over the other?
So I'm a big advocate of a 3-point landing. I'm pretty much, well, that's always the safest bet, is the 3-point landing. And I hate using a blanket statement, because there's airplanes out there that just don't want a 3-point. But those are relatively rare, I think, in the tailwheel world. And I'm relatively inexperienced. I've got about 300 hours of tailwheel time in, Taylor Crafts and RBs and some Cessna 180s and 185s. I tend to notice that the bigger, like the 185 and Cessna 180, 185, that typically likes to wheel land a little bit more, and it's a little more natural to wheel land than 3-point. But even if I was looking at a particularly challenging landing, I would probably like to do a 3-point, just because I'm at the slowest practical speed, because a 3-point is also known as a full stall landing.
Okay.
So a full stall landing means you've taken as much airspeed out of the equation as possible. Your main wings aren't flying anymore, which means your tail probably isn't flying anymore. And that's what we want. We want the plane not to be flying. We want to have ground control, and it's really hard to have ground control on landing rollout if part of the plane is still flying, specifically the tail.
Okay.
So a calm wind day, a wheel landing is just fine. If you're more experienced with the plane, wheel landings are good. But again, I always start the training out with 3-point landings, because you're at the lowest practical speed, and even if something bad does happen, well, you're at a really low airspeed.
Yeah.
If something bad happens in a wheel landing, well, by definition, the tail is still flying, which means your chances of ground looping are exponentially higher than if the tail isn't flying and you have tail wheel authority. So I'm kind of an advocate of that full stall 3-point landing is the safest way to land. When you get more experience, I'm sure you can go out and have fun with wheel landings.
Okay, this actually brought up my next question, which for some reason I was about to ask. How do I know I'm done flying? Is that when my tail wheel touches the ground, basically?
When you've turned the plane off and tied it down.
That makes sense.
That's when you're done flying, and you'll hear that. You got to fly the airplane all the way to the chocks, and you really do. You've got to fly it all the way to the chocks, because we were talking earlier. You could inadvertently become airborne in a gusty situation while you're taxiing. So do not stop flying the airplane. And that is a really common reason for ground looping on landing. And I see this in check rides all the time in regular tricycle gear airplanes, is an inexperienced pilot tends to let out a sigh of relief as soon as the wheels touch down. And it's like, oh, we've landed. And then the wind hits us and it starts picking up the wing, because those nice crosswind controls we had on final and touchdown, as soon as we land, we're like, all right, we've landed, and release those crosswind controls. And that's when bad things start to happen.
Yeah.
You've probably seen that in the Herc. The Herc's bad about doing it is if you release crosswind controls when you land, man, that thing will get away from you really quick. So even in a Herc, really you don't have to fly it necessarily to the chocks, because it's a 150,000 pound airplane, but you do have to fly it until you're at a taxi speed, basically. Because if you're above taxi speed, there's parts of that plane that are going to want to fly. And in a 700 pound, or 1,000 pound tail wheel, it's wanting to fly when it's tied down out there. That's why we have to tie it down, because it'll fly off if we don't.
Here's another question. So the plane we flew, it did not have flaps, but if you did fly a tailwheel aircraft with flaps, do you keep the flaps down on a short field landing?
Oh yeah, for the same reasons as a tricycle gear aircraft. Flaps are gonna increase drag and my angle of attack and allow me to descend and give me better visibility.
Oh, sorry. Let me rephrase the question. After touchdown.
Oh, after touchdown, when I dump the flaps, I would revert to the POH to see what the POH says.
Okay.
That is kind of there's an active debate on whether or not that's a good idea. I think with manual flaps on a non-complex airplane, because the danger here is if you're moving a flight control right after landing, you might accidentally retract the gear. Well, there's very few retractable gear tailwheel aircraft that you'd be doing short fields in.
Yeah.
So think of like a Cessna 185 has a great big manual flap handle right here. A lot of the tailwheel aircraft, flap-equipped tailwheel aircraft, are manual flaps. So it's almost impossible to confuse a big flap handle for a gear handle. So yeah, I would, and I think most of those POHs say as soon as you land, let's get rid of the flaps.
And we can have
And
more
that-
braking authority.
Yeah, that removes a lot of the lift from the wing and transfers the weight to the wheels, and the wheels have the brakes. That's what's stopping us.
Yeah.
And also the tailwheel authority comes in there. So yeah, I would dump the flaps normally if it was a flap equipped tailwheel.
Okay. This is the last question I have. So the Airplane Flying Handbook talks about sometimes in, like, I guess, drastic situations, you could potentially need differential braking on takeoff. And that would be to avoid a ground loop. How would I know if I need that?
Yeah, you mentioned that. I've never run into a case where I need brakes on takeoff. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. Is I want to make sure we're not adding any brakes inadvertently on takeoff. So we have heel brakes in the Tailorcraft. On any tow brake equipped tailwheel aircraft, one of the things that I announce if the rear seat or the front seat, if I'm given instruction, if they're equipped with brakes, I make sure I say heels on the floor when we get on the runway. In fact, I was doing some transition training for an RV8, and I was doing it from the back seat. The new owners in the front seat, I'm making sure that they know, hey, heels on the floor, because I don't have brakes in the back.
Yeah.
I just have a little bit of rudder authority, and I can't, obviously can't see if they're adding any brakes. So when you get on the runway, I'm like, hey, make sure your heels are on the floor so we don't inadvertently grab a brake on takeoff. So yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe in a much larger, I don't have a lot of like large tailwheel experience, but yeah, on a larger tailwheel, I could see maybe you needing to add some brake on takeoff, differential braking to avoid a ground loop. But at high power settings, our rudder is actually pretty effective because we're sending a lot of air over that control surface. So your rudder is generally very effective, and if you combine that with your tailwheel steering or tailwheel suggestion, it's going to be more than enough to keep the nose lined up on takeoff.
And it does talk about, hills on the floor, as much as possible. I just, it mentioned that too, and I just thought, that's weird. Why would you? Because I don't think I've ever used brakes on a takeoff in a tricycle gear. Not that I could think of anyways, but.
Yeah, at least not on purpose.
Not on purpose, yeah. Do you have any questions?
No, I always heard about rudder control. It's a lot different. You answered them.
Yeah,
Went through a lot of this.
on the ground stuff. I mean, on the ground, I was just blown away at just the difference in the, like, how just the movements of like dancing and punching. But
there's a lot of great footage on YouTube nowadays. But you can look at, there's some drone footage of like tailwheel aircraft landing. You can't see the pilot's feet, but watch the rudders on those landings. Watch how much that rudder is moving around, and it's not being blown around by the wind. That's pilot input. I can think of a few, drone following a tailwheel in on landing. You get that kind of nice high quality video from their 6 o'clock position, and you can see how much that rudder is moving.
yeah,
And that kind of gives you an idea of how much rudder dance is going on to keep that nose lined up.
that makes sense. I really appreciate this, man. It was so nice of you to do this. It really meant the world. And like I said, I'm blown away at how much fun flying one of these was. Now I have to buy one. Or, we were talking about this. I really want to build my own kit plane at some point. We talked about the RV-15. Maybe the RV company will watch this video and be like, oh yeah, let's hook you up, bro. But, I really want to build one of those. But, now he's got me wanting to buy a Tailorcraft too. So now I got to pick my battles.
Well, Tailorcraft's a great airplane. They're pretty affordable. They're pretty easy to maintain. They were built in a little bit of history. The the guy who basically built the Piper Cub, you know, broke away from the Piper company and built the Taylorcraft to make something better than the Cub. So he changed the form of the wing. He made it side by side instead of tandem seating. And it does fly better than a Cub.
I haven't flown a Cub yet, but
it's faster. It has better takeoff and landing performance. It's just not quite the same. You know, with the Cub, you get a little bit of the brand image. You know, it's a classic looking airplane.
It is.
But there's basically the only thing I like about the Cub over the Taylorcraft is the Cub has a stick.
I do like the stick.
Yeah,
it is an awesome
and
deal.
tandem seating, there are some advantages of that. As you know, when you're solo, of course, solo in a J3 Cub, you have to do from the back seat.
I actually did know that. That's the one thing I knew.
It's way less comfortable to fly a Cub solo than a Taylorcraft. But if you have a newer Cub, like the Carbon Cubs, you can solo those from the front, of course. And your visibility is great out both windows, so that's fun. You know, that's fine. But the Taylorcraft, man, I'm a Taylorcraft guy. So it was built in the 30s, and you know, back in the 30s there weren't like A&P shops. That wasn't even a thing. So they had to design the airplane where an owner could basically do all the maintenance. And so it's such a simple aircraft. I mean, you can, you know, of course, it's a certified aircraft, so in an owner, you know, you're still limited to owner maintenance, preventative maintenance, that is. But, you know, an owner-assisted annual, you could easily do in an afternoon with an experienced AMPIA, with how easy it is to pull inspection panels off, and the cowling, and you know, the engine's just all right there. Within, you know, 10 minutes you can have the entire front cowling off, and you've just got a great workspace to work on the engine and, you know, do oil changes and all that. It's just such an easy airplane to maintain.
Well, it's not much, but I wanted to get you something for, so I got you one of my hats here. Hopefully you wear hats.
Oh, nice.
I mean,
I like it.
So
I appreciate it. Well, you're sponsoring the VSL brand.
I see that, yeah.
So,
and so I guess we got to wear each other's hats
I'll
for
throw
today.
this on.
But you look good, man. But I really appreciate you doing this. It just meant the world. And like I said, I just can't believe how much fun it was.
Yeah, and that's what we like doing here. Is it's not just the tailwheel experience. We're really into the backcountry flying. And that's kind of it's going through a little bit of a renaissance here in Arkansas. We've got grass strips everywhere. So we've got places where you can fly, and there's little restaurants by the river. There's places you can go camping. But we call it kind of the low and slows. But flying relatively low and really slow, no place to go.
That is way more fun.
It's just so much fun.
Well, is it that time?
Is it time?
I think it's time.
All right. Let's get the tailwheel endorsement in there.
I got my private pilot's license in 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 20. It took me 7 years to get my, that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. Well, while Seth's filling this out, I really appreciate you guys watching today. If you enjoyed this video, please click that like button for me. Up next, we're gonna be doing 5 weird maneuvers in an airplane that you can do that's gonna make you a better pilot. And that's gonna be over on Seth's channel, but after this, I'm gonna put a link right here or in the description, and you can go check out that video. Thanks for watching. What's up, guys? I'm ready for my tailwheel lesson now.